In this video, we're going to be taking a look at how to set up UVs on a model. So UVs let you take a 3D object and lay it out in a 2D format so you can actually start painting on it. The main way that we're going to be taking a look at UVs is using a technique called planar mapping, which is more of a flat kind of mapping. And we've got this fish character here because he's probably going to work well with that mapping type. He's pretty flat for the most part, and he's got these little fins sticking out. So I think this will be a good example for you to get introduced to UVs and starting to understand how they work. So here I'm going to show you an example of what some of these UVs will actually look like when we're finished. So I'm going to open up the window UV texture editor window so we can look at the UVs on the model and take a look at what's going on here. So we've got half of our model, this side over here, laid out in this flat fashion, and we've got this side of our model laid out over here on this side as well. Basically, I've kept this model in half like this. We've been modeling one half of the model as a negative instance on this side, and whatever we do on this side happens on the other side. So when we're to the point where we're actually creating some UVs, we actually have to change some of that functionality to where we need to just build UVs for one side of the model. So I'm going to hide this side over here, and whatever we do on this side, we need to actually flip it and mirror it across. So there's some tools for mirroring, and we'll take a look at that. But I just want you to understand we're at this point now where we're going to kind of break away from this. Everything we're doing on this side matches up on the other side. We need some of that type of functionality, but we really need these things to be mirrored, because if you think about this, this is considered the 0 to 1 space for a texture map, and all that really means is there's coordinates going, if you can imagine in the world we've got X and Y, and we also have a Z dimension, but in 2D we only have something that's like an X and a Y coordinate, but that's what they consider U in V space. So that's why they call it UV mapping. We're taking this 3D object and mapping it to a 2D coordinate system. What that allows us to do is when we have a flat plane like this, we take it into a program like Photoshop and you paint pixels on here, and those pixels show up on the model in whatever area it's laid out here on the UV texture window. So Maya's added some cool functionality to let you see texture borders. So you can turn texture borders on and off, and this shows you basically where this thing is split on the model. It also has an icon here that you can turn on to display a checkered pattern, so you can kind of see a preview of what a texture, at least the pixels, might look like on here. And they just give you this checkered pattern, and it's kind of colored like this. And it kind of helps you understand what you're looking at. So you can see this side here is a bit more blue, and then this one's a bit more yellow because this side is over here, and then this side is over here. So the other thing we've got going on is I split the fin off from the body, and we have that laid out flat here. It's just because we can't just have the entire model and have anything kind of overlapping as far as UVs like this. So like if I took these UVs and I moved them and I overlapped them, they would be sharing texture space, and that's okay in some cases, but I want this, all the pixels on here that I'm going to be painting with on the fin, I want that to be unique and not part of the body. So you can see the way that this body is laid out, everything's kind of been flayed out a bit to where it's actually grown out along the edges a bit, and it allows you to have pixels that are going to go all the way around this thing, actually gets in the grooves of the mouth and things like that. So what I think is kind of helpful for understanding what's going on, everybody has clothes, everybody knows how a shirt kind of works and how when you put that thing on, if you imagine you have a t-shirt and it's got a a graphic tee, and you've got a graphic on the front of your shirt and a graphic on the back of your shirt. If you take a look at the shirt, you can see that typically the sleeves are sewn on to the body of the shirt, and a lot of times there might be a split running down both sides of your shirt, on the left side and the right side, and so you've got a front to your shirt, you've got a back to your shirt, you have your sleeves, and your sleeves usually have a seam that runs maybe under your arm or something like that. And if you could imagine, if you took those seams and you took scissors and you cut it all out and you laid out those pieces flat on a table that was in a square table, like your 0 to 1 space that we're taking a look at here, that's kind of really how UVs are working. You've got this 3D object, but we've got to split it apart and cut it apart as if it's kind of like a pattern that you would have for fabric and making like a jacket or a shirt or anything like that. It's just our pattern is a bit more complex. The other way that you can maybe think about these things is maybe you've all been to the grocery store and you've seen some elaborate helium balloons. And when they start off, they're pretty flat and there's no air in that, and they unfold that and put the helium in, and it inflates those balloons that you see. Well, all that started off as material that's flat, and then they had to be not sewn together, maybe glued together, or whatever that process is for building that thing out. But if you broke it down and split it back apart, you could lay the thing out flat. And they do have probably like graphics on it or something like that. So you can kind of imagine you're doing that process, but you're doing it in the computer, and we're all doing this work just to get it into this flat format so we can have things called textures, which are going to be put on there that lets us paint directly on this thing. So there's a rough understanding of why we're even doing the UV process, and what the end goal is just to get us to have a format that the computer understands so we can start painting on it. So I'm going to hide this model real quick, and we're going to select this half of the model, and you can see it's just got some junk UVs that are put on there. So imagine this as your texture right now. So you can see the pixels are all over the place, they're stretched and everything else like that. You could take these UVs and you can actually move them around, and you can see how it starts to make those things kind of swim on the page. What we're going to look at is a tool called the Planar Mapping tool, which will allow us to get a really quick mapping on this. Like I said, the overall shape of this is pretty much flat, so there's different mapping tools within Maya. If you go under the polygon menu subset, there is create UVs, and what we're looking at is the planar mapping. There is cylindrical mapping and spherical mapping. So just think about the shape that you need. If it's a bit more flat, you're going to use planar mapping. If it's a bit more cylindrical in nature, you're going to use the cylindrical mapping. And if it's more of a spherical kind of shape, then you're going to use this spherical mapping. So let's go to the spherical mapping and do the option box for this. And so we can say we're going to project from, and we've got, look at our little axis thing down here in the world. We've got X, we've got Y, and we've got Z. So imagine we're taking a plane and we're pushing it through the object. This thing really sits on this plane for Z and Y. So we want to take a plane and push it through X, like this. You see the X-axis runs this way? So imagine a big plane, and if I just did this, polygon primitives plane, and we did something like this. Let's give this a -90, like that, and we scale this thing up. The planar mapping is going to be, imagine these pixels just being pushed through the model, and it intersects the model like this and runs through it. Okay, that's basically what's going to be happening here. So I'm going to select this model, and we're going to say project from the X-axis, and I'm going to tell it to just do a bounding box around here, nothing special like that, and hit apply. So you can see it automatically gives us this manipulator that we can start messing around with. And you can see if you click and drag this part right here, you can see how it's kind of moving this thing around. So if I get a camera view that's maybe a little bit closer to what we're seeing here, this is kind of like we're moving this thing around on the page like that. So when it first does the projection, it's going to try to fit it all within the page, and it does a pretty good job of doing that. But we also have the opportunity to take this, click here, and then you got your normal moving tools. You could move it. You could scale this thing, so you could scale it this way, like this. Now one thing I want you to notice is as we scale it, and this thing gets smaller on this page. The pixels get larger and larger. That's because, imagine this is a Photoshop document and it's like 512 by 512 pixels. So you got 512 pixels this dimension, 500 pixels this dimension. If you scale this thing down, you know that in Photoshop, when you scale something down on the document, you're actually losing resolution on that, right? And so we could push that up there. Now I could have a page laid out with a bunch of different fish on here, and that would be fine, but the resolution only goes up so high, right? But if we have just one object and we want to use as much of the pixels as we possibly can, we want that to fill up more space. So we want to get it, closer to filling up the entire area like this. All right. So the other concept in doing UVs is that we can actually split our model apart. So if you select edges, and this is what I was talking about, where you've got a t-shirt and you could actually cut the sleeves off. So imagine we're working with a pair of scissors, or if you got that hot air balloon, you could actually cut that material with some kind of cutting device. So we select our edges, and we've got a little cut tool here. And we'll go ahead and cut that. Like I said, turning on texture borders with this tool will highlight where you have the model split at. And I think that becomes pretty handy and pretty useful for us. So now that that thing's been split, you can see there's a split all the way around the model, so we've kind of cut it off of the model. You never actually really affect the model, you're only affecting UVs at this point, so when I talk about cutting the model apart, don't kind of get worried about that. This is all just happening within the UV tools. They've got this handy tool here where you can click on this and just click one piece of the model and you can start to move it around. So you can see now I've got that fin and I've got it split apart. Okay. The other tool that I want to show you, I'm going to just drag a marquee around the entire object, is this smooth UV tool, which really gives you this unfold function. So once you click on it, you can click on the word unfold and click and drag out, and you can see how it just kind of slightly changed the outer edges of the border. And what it's really doing is it's comparing all these polygons in the world, they're spacing to one another, and it's trying to unfold or kind of relax these points to where all the spacing matches up a bit better on here. So in a case where there's a bigger difference, which will run this on the fin, you'll see kind of a bit more of how this kind of works. So right now, if I ran this tool on the fin, it's probably going to have some issues. I mean, it'll do it, but it's probably not going to give us the results that we're looking for. We really need a split on this fin. So I'm going to split going down here. So again, the end goal is to get this thing flattened out. So I need to find some kind of edges that run on here. The other thing is I like to try to choose edges that are going to be hidden, because anywhere where we're splitting this thing off, it becomes a chore for us as artists to kind of make sure that there's no seams right here. They call these UV border edges, and that becomes a job for us to make sure that there's no seams going from here to here for what we're painting. So go ahead and cut this part out right here with the cut tool, like that. And now I'm going to right click and say UV, and I'm going to use that unfold tool again. And you can see how it kind of, after running it a few times, it really does flay the whole thing out. So what we're really looking at, if we just go to our UVs, and I'll tap Q and then W for my move tool, and you can see if I select these, we're selecting this part. If we select this UV here, we've got this point, and if we select this one here, you can select it in the 3D view or you can select it over here. It's up to you. Now if you do notice that if we zoom in, we've got some curling in of this geometry here. So you see how that's getting a darker kind of blue color. That's because we have this thing turned on, and it's going to let us know if there's overlapping. It does a kind of a multiply effect on that, and it kind of gives us a darker shading so we can understand that those UVs are overlapping each other. So This unfold thing does give you pretty good results, but sometimes you might want to just hand tweak some of the results just a little bit. And you do want to be careful of what you're pushing around, because you could actually start to stretch the UV. So you see how this kind of gets a little bit odd right here. So you might have to kind of watch that a little bit. So it's going to push this here like that. Just try to make sure, like, this checkered pattern, you want it to be as close to a actual square as possible. It's not always going to be perfect, but that's the goal. That's the reason why we're using this checkered pattern. So now you can see how this is UV1 UV1 V1. This is the area that we want to work on. If we turn this texture thing off, we can definitely see with this gray shaded area. We want to move this thing back here. So we can select that, and you can always use your move tool, or again you could put it on this tool here and just click and drag it over. And you can see we want to give enough spacing in between here. Maybe fill it up just a little bit like that. There. Okay. And pretty much that's all we have to do for this portion of the UVs for this thing. So I do need to talk to you about overlapping UVs. So if we took this model and we duplicated it, which we've already got a duplicate over here, so I'll unhide it because we've got that negative instance thing going on. If we duplicated both these models, I'm going to hit Control D, and actually hit Shift P to unparent it. Let's just hide everything. So I'm going to select that and hit Control H. So I've got this half, and I'll hit Control D to duplicate it just as a regular copy. And I'll give it a negative scale over here like this. And you can see if we freeze the transformations on this and get rid of the scaling information, we'll go Modify Freeze Transformations. And you can see what happens to this side now. It turns red because it recognizes that the normals of this model, if I go to Display Polygons, Custom Polygon Display, and I turn on my normals, the normals are facing the correct way. But now what we have is a mix match between what's going on with our UVs and what's going on with the world. So you can see right now, this side of the model, the UVs are pointing out the right way, so all the shading is correct for it. But if we look at the UVs for it, they're flipped, they're backwards. So it's pretty easy to flip those things. We can go to UV like this, and we can just hit this, and we can flip horizontal, or we can do vertical, and we can flip it back. I'm going to flip it back. This red thing is going on because we got this little indicator that, remember, that was turning blue, and if they overlap each other, it shows you where maybe some faces are kind of overlapping each other. But if they're facing the wrong direction, it'll shade red like this. But what we have currently is a setup where if you're doing hand-painted textures, let me turn off these normals real quick. If you're doing hand-painted textures, you could share the UVs on this side, and basically anything you paint on this page will show up on both this side and this side of the model. And that's pretty beneficial. The only thing is, you know, you can't get any variation. You can't have like a big scar running down on this side of the face and not this one. If you have a big scar here, it's going to show up on both of them. The other thing to think about is if you have text. If you wrote any kind of text on this side of the fish, it's going to be inverted on this side. It's just like a mirror copy, a mirror version of it. But you know, when you have to paint something and you're trying to get as much resolution as you can out of it, this can be a good option for you. You just have to kind of know the limitations of it. So there is the possibility, say you did want to paint a scar on this side of the head, you would have to take this portion of the model like this, and you would have to cut it out with this. I'll turn on the texture borders, and then I'll select this with a UV, right here, and you would have to move that chunk over like this. I'll select it, and then we could flip it, and now you got a correct direction for it. And you'd have to find some spot on the map that was open like this, and then now you could paint just something that's just specific for that portion of the head. And so now you're sharing the UV space. If I select this and this together, you can see how we could paint a head, and then we could paint this thing here and have its own little scarring and stuff like that on there. So there are some tricks that you can use to get a little bit of variation on one side from another and still be painting all in one map. Where this breaks down though is later on we're going to be talking about normal maps, and normal maps can have a problem in some game engines where it can't share normal maps that are on this side and this side, because when we get into normal maps we'll discuss this more, but normal maps really kind of indicate like lighting and shading on the model, and it picks up on lighting directions of the model. There's actually a directional component going on with the normal map, and so if your game engine doesn't know what to do with it, it's got some kind of direction for this side, and if it doesn't know how to flip it on the other side, it'll look like it's inverted and it'll be kind of weird. So just something to be cautious about. But that's a quick look at UVs. There are a lot of other tools within here, and we'll probably get into some of these tools a bit more as we cover some more complex topics. But this will be enough for now, and I thought the fish example would be pretty good for getting you into the introduction and just letting you understand a little bit about UVs and how they work. The last thing I think I could say about this is when we're done with the model, we're finally at this point where we can go and say, okay, now we're going to take the model and we're going to combine them together. So we're going to go to Mesh, Combine, and we've already looked at combining our models already, so that's not a big deal, but we want to make sure everything's sewn up, so we're just going to convert that selection type for the object to verts. So we just hit Control F9 and then Control right click, and we're going to do merge vertices and do the option box and just give it a really low threshold like that. And then you could fix up maybe the shading on this, the normals in certain areas. So I could just run this along here like this, and then go to soften edge like that. I like the hard edge on some of these some of the fins, but I do want to get some smooth shading on some parts of the model like this. So I just hit G from my last command because I already did that. And basically you would have a version of your model that's ready to go. So I have this version that I just showed you guys. I'm going to push this off to the side, and then I had that other version that was already finished. So I'll bring that back. So here's this version here, and that really uses up a whole lot of the space for the texture. This version here that I started off with is more of, if your game engine can't handle normal maps and it can't flip them, you're going to have some kind of setup like this where one side and the other side are completely and totally unique. The other thing that's kind of cool about this setup is that this side of the fish can be completely and totally different than the other side of the fish on here. Now it does, you want to steal as much work as you possibly can when you're painting, but it does give you the opportunity to do some cool, unique patterns and things like that. And just as an artist, it kind of frees you up a little bit. This is a bigger palette to kind of work with, but both ways are going to be pretty cool for you to work with, and you're going to be able to be very creative with both methods.